people think they're better than black people, and they want to oppress us, and they want us to allow ourselves to be oppressed.
This is the big, I agree with you perfectly. This is the basic problem.
Then what do you
that
want
white
to talk to me
people
about?
think they're better
That
than
I can
others.
Do? I can't solve the problem. You guys pull the strings that close schools. You guys draw the boundaries that keep our kids restricted to the ghetto. So it's up to you to talk to your brothers and your sisters and persuade them that they have a responsibility. We've assumed ours for over 400 years. No more turning the other cheek. No more blessing our enemies. No more praying for those who despitefully use us. We're going to show you that we've learned the lessons you've taught us. We've studied your history, and you did not take over this country by singing "We Shall Overcome." You couldn't walk around and talk to people, stand up in your pulpit on Sunday and preach nice little songs and say, now we're going to give thanks to the Lord for he is good and old Jesus be among us. As far as we're concerned, your Jesus is contaminated, just like everything else you tried to force upon us is contaminated.
Well,
so you can have him.
Historically, right, race has always been intimately tied to notions of value and power. You know what I'm saying? That concept from its inception, right? When this notion of race is kind of becoming crystallized, here in the Western world, has always had to do with value and power.
The problem is when people don't see themselves dignified as they survey the land, what they begin to do is say, hey, I'm going to create dignity within myself. It's like, well, I don't have to be objected to the slave master theology or teaching or religion. I'll create my own. And then you begin this narrative of Christianity as a white man's religion.
The one aspect of life that no other man should be able to control is your relationship with God, because we're all created in the image of God. And I believe black men are saying, this is one area, spirituality, religion, that white men are not going to control in my life.
I remember going into the seminary one day and I saw a picture of Jesus. Beautiful picture of Jesus, white, blonde hair, beautiful. But I said to my coworker, I said, imagine if you put a picture of Jesus with an afro, slightly brown. What would it mean? Can we still see Jesus as our Savior if he just has a little bit of a tan?
Folks are not going for, I believe it just cuz, right? And so if they are under the impression that you are just believing something just cuz, then it's just not gonna be appealing. They're not gonna take you seriously.
People's corrupted practices to be the basis by which we judge the faith.
A lot of black people, particularly black men, do reject Christianity just based on an emotional level, okay? And then once you can remove that stumbling block from their minds that Christianity is a white man's religion, then it just comes down to, will they accept or reject the gospel?
Controversies over the legacy of racism in America have even flared up criticism of the image of Jesus Christ.
That image of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus is kind of the premier symbol, one of the first symbols of white supremacy.
Talk about people who know religion.
And so if you look at Russian art, for example, Jesus looks Russian. If you look at
official
Italian art, Jesus looks Italian. If you look at Jesus Christ Superstar, Jesus form based in his world. But when images of Jesus go to other...
Okay, so Adley, again,
Yeah,
you're
an American
getting too
movie.
serious. You're getting too serious on this.
I mean, the three common objections that I often hear, right, are, of course, Christianity is a white man's religion, right?
It was, brought to slaves from their masters as a means to oppress them.
As long as you got black people worshiping a white Jesus, you will never ever truly rebel against your oppressors, because when you see them, you see God.
That's a fact.
You know what I'm saying?
How can you as a black man hold on to white Jesus, our oppressor's religion?
Your discourse on Christianity leads me to believe that you agree with many Muslims that Christianity is anti-Negro.
Yes. You'll hear that Christianity is just a copy of the ancient Kemetic religion that Africans practiced in Egypt thousands of years ago.
If you listen to John Henry Clark, if you read Chanti Diop, you know the biblical text, the Quran, the Torah, are versions that have been taken out of Kemet, taken out of the Eastern Horn of Africa.
You're a slave to a book.
Christianity is a tool to keep black people docile and weak.
You have people out here believing that it's, maybe not just the white man's religion, but maybe the dumb man's religion.
I think I'm this close, if I'm not already there, to being a black atheist.
You look at the Hamitic curse, or the curse of Ham.
This idea that Ham was actually cursed.
All black people have been cursed. If you consider Christianity, or American Christianity in particular, I think it's easy to assume that when a lot of the spokesmen for religion might be white. Most of our commentaries are written by white men.
You look at the paintings and the pictures of all the biblical characters being white.
If you want to regard him as black or Chinese, that's your business, but he has been depicted traditionally as being white.
Paul was white, Moses was white.
Jesus was a white man too.
Jesus was white, the Ethiopian eunuch was white. Moses' wife was white. Esther was white.
There's a subtle psychological nuance that I think that is damaging to people when you go into a church and all you hear are quotes that are taken from white people, not only white people, but most likely white slave owners.
Do you think the criticisms that they have of Christianity are bad?
If you don't know history, yes.
I think they come to those conclusions because they haven't had access.
We do a disservice when all we do reference is white historians, or all we do reference is white commentators.
When you hear about church history and you never hear the affirmation of black people or black women or even indigenous people.
Asian, Egyptian, African authors.
We, I think, haven't communicated that black voices and that African Christianity is the primary influence on Christianity and always has been. We just don't know it. And so I think we have done a disservice because we haven't educated our own selves.
Most people are bad historians and even worse philosophers. And they really don't take a lot of time to think through their own objections to see if they really stand up to scrutiny. They just kind of, maybe find an objection and just take it at face value. Whereas I think that if you take each of those reasons and really break them down, I don't think that they stand up logically or historically for that matter.
Bible itself, we have evidence of Africans who believed in the name of Jesus Christ and began to follow him from a very early stage, from the very beginning.
The black presence in the Bible starts in Genesis and it goes all the way over to Revelation.
Black nations are mentioned more than 1,000 times in the Bible, while European nations, most notably Greece and Rome, are mentioned a combined 50 times in the Old Testament.
We talk about the black and African presence in the Bible. Some folk will say, well, why do you need to talk about black? Just talk about African presence in the Bible. Well, simply because there are color terms, names, and adjectives that signify black people in reference to our dark skin color in the Bible. Terms that signify blackness are thousands of years older than the term Africa. Ham, which means hot, heat, black, phonetically related to Kemet. Cush means black. Kedar, the grandson of Abram, and Hagar, the Egyptian. Kedar means very black, exceedingly black, blue black, midnight black, purple black, jet black. The Kedarites was an ancient Arabian tribe. Niger, prophets and teacher in the church at Antioch. One was called Niger, the black man. That's a term, it means black. Africa is never, the word is never used in the scripture. Places on the continent of Africa are used in the scripture.
one of the things we have to come to grips with is the differing definitions of how we use the term black. So when we think about, like, for example, American laws in the South, if you had one drop of black blood, you were considered black and you were subject to the segregation laws. And so historically, the definition of black in the South has been basically any color at all made you prime for discrimination. And one of the interesting things about biblical scholarship is when you flip that around and you begin to ask the question, well, who is black and African in the Bible? And the standard goes really, really high. So unless you're from like the Sudan or Ethiopia, they somehow take you from the category of black. And so when you ask the question of what's the African presence in the New Testament, it's right there at the center of it. If you think about the person who carried the cross, Simon of Cyrene was a person of color.
Jesus, who is we're on the road to Golgotha, being about to be crucified, and he's carrying the cross up to Golgotha. There is an African man, Simon of Cyrene of Libya, northern Africa, who is ordered to carry the cross of Christ. He participates in the crucifixion. This black man participates in the crucifixion of Jesus. That impact, no doubt, stays with him. He takes this back home, and you have this influence of Christ, or the life of Christ, in northern Africa, moments or hours after taking his last breath. All of this is taking place within what I like to call an Afro-Asiatic context. You have Palestine, which it seems like it's just a walk's journey from northern Africa. So you have the Ethiopian eunuch, who is actually in Jerusalem in the book of Acts chapter 8.
In the Greek language, when someone would say that someone was Ethiopian or Aethiopos, that was just another way of saying they were black or they were dark skinned. But sometimes it would, refer to different ethnicities like Nubian or actual Ethiopian, or what was called Axum. Even sometimes Arabian, or even as far as India, people would sometimes be called Ethiopian. And so when the eunuch that's mentioned in Acts 8 is called an Ethiopian, that's just, again, another way of saying he's black.
He somehow has encountered this message about Christianity. And so therefore, as Acts chapter 8 shows, that he then asked to understand more of the gospel from Philip. And then he even is the one that asked to be baptized.
The Ethiopian eunuch was baptized by Philip, and he says right there in the scripture, I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That's 600 years before the religion of Islam was even created. So you can easily debunk the notion that Islam's a religion of the black man and Christianity is a religion of the white man.
There are other prominent blacks like Zephaniah the prophet, who said his father was named Cushai, which means black.
Nimrod, who was the grandson of Cush in Genesis, the book of Genesis.
Paul, who's mistaken as an Egyptian in Acts 21, mistaken as an Egyptian revolutionary.
In the Song of Solomon, in chapter 1, verse 5, it says that the woman that Solomon is talking about and writing this love letter to was a black woman. And the literal translation of it says she was dark and comely, black and beautiful. Isaiah chapter 18, verse 2 says that the Ethiopians were a people who were terrible from their beginnings onward. And that word, the Hebrew word that's translated terrible, actually means awesome. And it's also used to describe God, the great and terrible God and things like that.
As Jesus is literally walking to the cross, African person. Right after Pentecost and the Spirit comes in, one of the first converts who gets his own narrative, African person.
We're not trying to paint the Bible black. We're just trying to be honest where blackness is. That's very, very, very important.
The seeds for scriptural interpretation that became common Christian teaching were first sown on the African continent.
Christianity, I really like to understand, as Tom Oden calls in his project, was birthed out of an African seedbed.
My name is John Mbiti. I'm an African theologian and pastor from Kenya and Switzerland.
The philosopher John Mbiti makes this statement. He says, Christianity in Africa is so old that it can be rightly described as an indigenous, traditional, and African religion.
most influential thinkers and writers in early Christianity come from North Africa.
Most of us have heard the names John Calvin, Martin Luther, and John Chrysostom, and many of other European, Greek and Latin, and then later European church fathers. We've all heard of St. Patrick, right? But there are many African church fathers and mothers that many of us don't even know about.
Once the apostles are dead or persecuted, what happens is we never move east or south and talk about the history that happened east or south in church history. We always move northwest, right? So we go to Switzerland, we go to Germany.
When you see the story going from Jerusalem to Rome, from the beginning of, say, the book of Acts to the end of book of Acts, you're missing that there's also a story that would go from Jerusalem to Alexandria, or Jerusalem going to Cyrene, or Jerusalem going to other parts of North Africa.
In North Africa, we start to see evidence, like sort of literary evidence, around 180, but we know that there must have been a Christian presence before that.
Legend has it that the Apostle Mark was one of the ones that brought the gospel to Egypt. So it's one of the disciples, the legend has it, very there. If it wasn't Mark, it's clearly somebody who's part of that first generation of Christians, because Christianity is in at least Egypt and maybe a little further west of there by that first generation.
If you think about North Africa, obviously some of the big names that come up are people that maybe some people have heard of, Tertullian and Cyprian, and Augustine.
Tertullian coins the Latin word trinitas for Trinity. That word's not in our Bible. He has to come up with that word to explain how the Father is God and Jesus is God and the Spirit is God, and yet there's one God. So he says there's a tri-unity.
Likewise in Egypt, there's many theologians that some people have heard of, like Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Athanasius, and Cyril of Alexandria.
Another major writer is Augustine. Augustine of Hippo is the biggest, most influential Christian writer from the ancient world, especially for the Latin West. But most people don't even realize that he's writing from North Africa as an African. He refers to himself as an African. So he's certainly the most influential. And then there would be dozens and dozens of others whose names are usually not even recognized or remembered. Within the Roman Empire at large, we think of the sort of Roman culture taking over and conquering these areas, and that was true to a large extent, but you also had the local indigenous culture. The Punic language was still spoken, the Punic deities were still worshipped by local peoples, and so that culture is still present, and you can even see remnants of that in early African Christians.
In North Africa, Christian theologians never wrote in the indigenous language. Even though we know that there were Christians, Augustine even mentions it, there were Christians who spoke that language. The theologians of that area didn't write in that language.
Most Christians spoke Latin, like the rest of Western Christianity.
Latin was seen as the prestigious language, and Tamazight was seen as the barbarian language. That's even where the word Berber comes from. In the same way, in Egypt, Greek was seen as the higher language, and native Egyptian or Coptic was seen as the lower language. I think what's really important is for us to put special attention on the theologians that wrote in the indigenous African languages, because when they did that, they were making a statement to say that black is beautiful, that Africa is beautiful, that African languages are beautiful. And so when you think about Coptic in Egypt, the first texts that we have are surrounding a figure named Pachomius, that he was the founder of communal monasticism in Egypt. And he has a biography as well as his monastic rules that are written in the Coptic language. But the name that all of us definitely should know and be engaging with, especially for African history, period, is Shenouda of Atrip. Shenouda of Atrip is the greatest writer in the history of the Coptic language. He wrote dozens and dozens of sermons and theological compositions that dealt with Orthodox theology, exposition on scripture, and also refuting pagan Egyptian practices. Another name that we should know is Georgius of Sagla. Georgius of Sagla is seen as the greatest theologian in the Ethiopian tradition. He wrote lots of different texts, but his most famous was called the Masafa Mestir, or the Book of Mystery. And in this book, Georgius of Sagla writes in the Ethiopian language a systematic theology addressing point by point all of the doctrines of Christianity, the Trinity, the divinity and humanity of Christ. He also combats against Ethiopian paganism as well, and he lays out the Christian faith in a contextualized Ethiopian format and in the Ethiopian language.
Christianity was a place in Africa that was going through revival, intellectual, theological development. Many of your Christological debates and arguments, all of those things were really centered in Africa. And many of the great persecutions were targeted towards African Christians.
The blood of the martyrs is like seed, says Tertullian, the first North African writer. He says, as often as you mow us down, we spring back up.
In North Africa, especially in the city of Carthage, some of the earliest theologians and Christian figures were active in North Africa and Carthage, like Perpetua and Felicity.
Perpetua and Felicity are sort of seen as the quintessential Christian women in North Africa.
They were from the same area of North Africa as Tertullian. They were from Carthage. And of course, there was, this was Roman territory. So during this time, there was heavy persecution of Christianity in throughout the Roman Empire, particularly in Africa.
Perpetua wrote the story about how her and Felicity were persecuted for the faith, and this was right around the year 200. And Perpetua, who wrote that story, is the first female Christian author, who also happened to be a North African female Christian writer.
Perpetua comes from some sort of wealthy noble family. Felicity is a slave, and they're a part of a group of new Christians who've been arrested. They're going to be condemned to the beasts, and before they go out into the arena, Perpetua and Felicity embrace one another and greet each other with a kiss, what Paul would call a holy kiss, before going out to face their death. So they're commemorated every year in North Africa. The day they died is a day that they are celebrated in the church, in the Christian worship.
This is really significant because it gives us a picture of early Christianity, what it was like, the danger of it. And of course, there were many believers who did recant Christianity. And sometimes they would make their way back to many of those congregations wanting to be accepted again. And so this created basically another controversy in the early church. It was called the controversy of the lapse or the lapsi.
The lapsed were basically those folks who denied Christ under persecution. The question was, can these people, again regain fellowship, into the body of Christ, or have they denied Christ and are therefore cut off, henceforth and forevermore, Now, that raises an interesting issue because there's all these questions about Constantine and his influence at the Council of Nicaea, and was Christian doctrine somehow influenced, compromised, or tainted, by Constantine's influence? Early on, you have like 4 outposts or hubs of Christianity, if you will. You've got Jerusalem, you've got Rome, you've got Antioch, and you have Alexandria, Egypt, right? Actually, the first seminary anywhere on the planet was established in Alexandria, Egypt, the Alexandrian Catechetical School, right? So Alexandria, Egypt is a center of theology. Out of that, you have Origen comes out of there. You got Athanasius is in Alexandria, Egypt. And then you also have a guy who comes along named Arius.
Arius is the priest who begins to think of Jesus as the first creature. He allegedly teaches that Christ at one time did not exist, but was born, or in a way created by God. And then he became this powerful being that God used to create and save the world.
Now that view clashed with, Athanasius and Bishop Alexander at the time, who was the bishop over Alexandria, Egypt. It clashed with the view that no, Jesus is fully man, fully God. He's not created. He's divine in the same sense that, God the Father is divine. And actually in Alexandria, you have this, what you might call a provincial council. It's kind of like a smaller council to kind of hash this issue out, and Arius was defeated.
His theology was addressed by Bishop Alexander of Alexandria, and he was condemned.
And so when he is renounced in Alexandria, he goes to another town, Nicomedia, which is in the northern eastern part of the Mediterranean.
He goes into another region, he's teaching that stuff, and so now it's not just this localized Alexandrian issue. Now it's cropping up in other places, within, the area of Christian influence, right? Still within a different part of Rome, the Roman Empire. And so it's causing like mad beef. There's like a real theological beef going on, right? Now at the same time, politically, you have Constantine, right? He's an emperor. He's trying to, take control of the Roman Empire. He wants to establish himself as being the guy. And, having schism in the church, given the numbers of Christians you had at the time, that would go against his, goal of having peace within his kingdom.
Because there's this now widespread dispute, Constantine summoned what was supposed to be a worldwide council.
And so the Council of Nicaea was called by Constantine to deal with the question of Jesus' divinity.
That issue right there is the centerpiece of why the Council of Nicaea is called, to resolve that theological concern.
Now, Constantine didn't actually care one way or the other. Constantine didn't care whether or not we said Jesus was God or that Jesus wasn't God. What Constantine cared about was the stability of the empire.
Constantine was really interested in Pax Romana, and so Pax Romana, or the peace of Rome, was a core value of the Roman Empire.
So he says, whatever y'all say theologically, I don't care. You go and you guys fight it out, but I want one policy.
And so he plays a role in organizing the Council of Nicaea, where you have all these bishops and various different theologians coming to this place called Nicaea to hash this issue out. Is Jesus a created being or not? Is he eternal? Is he divine in the same sense that the Father is divine?
What happened was the vast majority of the people at Nicaea affirmed the divinity of Jesus.
Their view that Christ was co-eternal with the Father and that the Son is of the same substance or essence of the Father. He's fully divine, just as the Father is. That was the view that was the clear majority at Nicaea.
Now, what's funny is, on the internet, you get all kinds of different, theories, and they pretty much make the Council of Nicaea about everything but what it was actually about, you know what I mean?
Christianity was invented at the Council of Nicaea by Constantine.
The Bible was written at the Council of Nicaea. Jesus was created at the Council of Nicaea, which is nonsense, because we have documentation, like I mentioned earlier, like from Tertullian, where he's talking about Jesus, or Origen.
You look at Origen, you look at Tertullian, you look at Polycarp, you look at Irenaeus, and you begin looking in their writings, you hear Tertullian calling Jesus God.
Some of the earliest theologians to espouse the doctrine of the Trinity and argue for the divinity of Christ came from Africa. People like Tertullian and people like Cyprian and like Clement and Origen, who argued for the divinity of Christ 2 centuries before the Council of Nicaea.
My favorite part of the Council of Nicaea's story is that the council was supposed to represent the worldwide church, and yet it was mostly Eastern bishops who were able to travel there. And they had been debating for some time how to formulate a creed that would rule out Arianism. So my favorite part is when 2 representatives sent from the Bishop of Rome show up, and they sort of shrug their shoulders and look around and say, the North African writer Tertullian figured this out all the way back in 208. The phrase you're looking for in Latin is una substantia tres persona, or this is one substance, 3 persons, and the Greek word for una substantia, homoousios, is the word that is adopted into the creed, and it's the formal definition of Christ's full divinity. So when this phrase comes from Tertullian for so long ago and arrives at Nicaea, all the bishops kind of have to nod and say, oh yes, this is the exact terminology we've been looking for.
Long before Constantine, some of the earliest apologists, like Justin Martyr, who was from Asia Minor, Irenaeus, who was also from Asia Minor, Tatian the Syrian, also from Asia Minor, the majority of Christian apologists in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries before the Council of Nicaea believed in the Trinity, in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and they believed in the full divinity and humanity of Jesus Christ. So that doctrine was not invented at the Council of Nicaea, and there's 300 years of Christian theology that happened before the Council of Nicaea. Again, that was written by Christians in the Roman Empire who were being persecuted for their faith.
When you call the first Council of Nicaea, the accounts of the bishops who are coming to Nicaea are coming with wounds. There's some who've been abused. There's some who've been martyred.
Some of these guys are showing up, maimed and, are described as, maybe lost eyes and have endured real persecution. And at the council, they're deciding that if you buckled under that persecution, you're not part of us. Those aren't the kind of people who are then going to turn around and then buckle under the authority of Constantine, just for the sake of, compromising or whatever the gospel. These are people who stood through the worst persecution.
When Constantine made Christianity to be seen as the Roman religion, that was actually the beginning of this problem that we are still dealing with right now. We're dealing with this dynamic that Christianity is seen as the white man's religion. It's seen as a Western religion, right? That began with Constantine. The doctrine of Jesus' divinity didn't begin with Constantine. The doctrine of the Trinity didn't begin with Constantine. But the doctrine or the idea, the perception that Christianity is a Western white man's religion, that began with Constantine. Before that, Christianity was not associated with any people group. It was in Africa, it was in Asia, it was in India, it was in the Middle East, it was in Persia, it was in Europe, it was all over the world. It wasn't associated with any one people group.
In the face of persecution and misunderstanding and hostility, Christianity grows to be a force in the world, and Constantine recognizes that, and he begins to say, well, how can I use that to my ends? But it is not Constantine who makes Jesus a central figure in Roman culture. It's the first generation of Christians who converted to Christianity when there was no cultural benefit for them to do so.
Is the tradition of Kemet the original form? Yes. But just as if you have a copy of a copy of a copy, it loses its clarity and focus. Just as it becomes filtered through the traditions of other nations and other peoples, it loses its clarity and focus. So carbon copy, no, but copy, yes.
There's a great deal of pseudo scholarship in the conscious community. I mean, when you read conscious literature, whatever it's promoting, you really have to double and triple check the sources.
Let's be really clear about something here. The Christian tradition is not a carbon copy of the Kemetic tradition. In fact, what we see is a tradition that is filtered, stolen, then filtered through the social mores of another group of people.
Christianity, the African was practicing and not giving it a name. This is why you don't know nothing about the African origins of Christianity.
It's a farce. It was only... You realize what you're saying? A farce, a lie. You know what a lie is? A lie is a lie.
The African origins of the major Western religions. Africa, mother of Western civilization, a black man of the Nile.
This is a copy family, a poor copy. The things that you hear and that you love are actually the echo of something that your African foreparents gave you.
The copycat objections of the conscious community, basically theirs come from a group of 19th century mystics. One of those mystics is the mother of the conscious community, Helena Blavatsky. Helena Blavatsky was born, I believe, in 1831, and what's interesting about Helena Blavatsky is she began believing that she was getting her understanding of life and truth from these ascended masters, of course, demons, spiritual, it's a whole situation. But her, Gerald Massey, and then later on is Alfred Boyd Kuhn. Those are three of the spiritual parents of the conscious community, all white European people. And so they call us the Christianity, the white man's religion, but all of their forefathers admitted by John Henry Clark in the great debate that he did. He did a huge debate, basically, of him admitting that these people helped start Afrocentrism as we know it today.
So I began to read European masterpieces, and I began to read European curiosity about Africa. Gerald Massey's 6 volume, Egypt, Light of the World, 2 volumes. Natural Genesis, 2 volumes. Book of the Beginning, 2 volumes. And I began to read Gerald Massey's attitude on religion and his idea that nearly European concepts of religion was stolen.
The irony is that a lot of these people who want to say that Christianity is a white man's religion and they want to debunk aspects of white supremacy, they only do it using European sources. They'll argue against white supremacy using white sources.
Masterpieces by white radical writers who set the black radical writers in motion. A whole lot of claims blacks did not make until they saw the documents in what's written by Europeans.
When you look at John Henry Clark, the books like Destruction of a Civilization, Warren Williams, all those guys, Chancellor Williams, when you look at all of the, James G. Jackson, when you look at all of these different books that came out in mid-20th century, those books, they got all of their understandings of that there. So the whole copyist idea, it's a book called Who is the King of Glory? I have it in my possession. Albert Boyd Kuhn, it constructed false connections between Christianity and Egyptian or Kemetic spirituality. And one of the ways that they continuously did that was utilize false creations of Christ's connection to the god Horus, the whole Osiris story. There is no historical documentation. Like they said, well, it's in the books of the dead. Well, which book of the dead? There's a bunch of them. So which ones are those? And then when you actually look into the documentations of the Egyptian books of the dead, when you look at the whole Horus parallels, when you look at the Osiris parallels, you can't find a day that he was born on December 25th. First of all, Jesus wasn't born on December 25th.
Heru is usually born on December 25th.
If Horus was born on December 25th, cool. But Jesus wasn't. One of the things that is very, very important to understand is these people weren't even trained in history. They weren't trained in how to do history. None of them have a degree in Egyptology. They don't even have, if you look at Albert Boyd Kuhn stuff, you'll begin to see that he didn't source his information in anything systematically and historically that will let you know that he got them from these specific places. And so there are a lot of historical fallacious mistakes that the conscious community makes because it's so pushing and burdened with trying to discredit Christianity, it doesn't think objectively at times.
Look, was Christ really buried? Is his whole story very fairy and I was just a man? Did they really find his bones and then lie to keep the code, or did he walk out of a tomb to a throne? Was he God? Was he not? Did he buy us a spot in the heaven, or is all this a ruse? Are we just delusional dudes who refuse to believe in the truth? Are we fools? Is all this the white man religion? European invention to try to weak the submission. How can an African like me get the vision when these preachers own slaves but taught that freedom was Christian? Christ to the culture, Christ to the vultures, committed genocide with a cross and a holster. Christ of America, Christ to the system. That is not my savior, that's a politician. Christ that the Lord knows, Christ that was foretold, Christ that should have come back in his war clothes. Which Christ do you believe? You gotta know before you leave.
So let's juxtapose the spread of Christianity in Africa with the spread of Islam in Africa. Were they different and how so?
But the Bible was and is of black Africa. We believe in Jesus, the Lord, the Savior, and the Master. But don't bring me no far there to our damn.
The spread of Islam in Africa was primarily by sword. the spread of Christianity was by peace. They talk a lot about the transatlantic slave trade, but the trans-Saharan slave trade began around in the 9th century. And in effect, while it was officially supposed to have ended, in reality, that slave trade has not ended at all. This is exactly what's going on in places like Libya and Sudan and in parts of Nigeria today.
When we were on the slave plantation, our slave masters named their slave after themselves. Here we are 100 years up from slavery, still wearing the white man's name.
It's very interesting for a Muslim, especially a Nation of Islam adherent, to say, I'm dropping my slave name and adapting a name like Muhammad. I get that Smith and Johnson are indeed slave names, but in fact, Muhammad and Khan and all of these kinds of Arabic names represent slavery for a longer period of time and a more devastating impact on Africans than the transatlantic slave trade, which only lasted a quarter of the time of the trans-Saharan slave trade. Christianity and the spread of Christianity in Africa took nothing culturally away from Africa, and it introduced nothing culturally that could not be contextualized to Africa. But Islam is a complete Saudi Arabian import. There is nothing about Islam that is African in influence, but that cannot be said of Christianity.
When one looks at the first 6 centuries, one will see that Africans are accepting Christianity voluntarily. Matter of fact, by the 300s, in the 4th century, Ethiopia, which is an independent kingdom at that time, it is run by Ethiopian monarchs. They embraced Christianity on their own.
In the 4th century, there was a Syrian missionary named Frumentius who shared the gospel with the king of Ethiopia, whose name was Ezana. And Ezana believed the gospel, and he embraced Christianity as the national religion of Ethiopia. And it's been that way consistently for the last 1,700 years.
They have a large army. They are not trying to find in any way to use Christianity as a means of getting protection from someone else. They stand on their own 2 feet, as it were.
Ethiopia, which is the only African country to never have been colonized and has been an independent Black African nation for the entirety of its history, has also been a Christian nation, one of the oldest Christian nations in history.
Many Muslims are under the impression that that first hijrah was from Mecca directly to Medina. That is incorrect. The first hijrah or flight was from Mecca to Ethiopia.
Ethiopia always had a special place in the heart of Muslims and still does, because in Muhammad's early days, when he was being persecuted and some of his followers were being persecuted, some of them left the Arabian Peninsula and went over the Red Sea into Ethiopia, and the Ethiopians gave them shelter.
Under the Ottoman dynasty, the Muslim rulers do not go back to Ethiopia to conquer it. And so it seems to suggest that there is some deep appreciation for the fact that Christianity was very gracious and kind to their ancestors.
When Black Panther came out, it was almost like water in the desert for African descended people to see an all-Black movie, and even just to imagine, like the comic has done for 50 years, to imagine a completely independent African civilization that is actually advanced and is not synonymous with poverty or need or anything like that, but is actually advanced and full of beauty and culture and advanced science and architecture and literature. And there were so many people that were walking around saying Wakanda forever, and everybody was saying, I want to go to Wakanda, and even people say, I wish we had a Wakanda. But when I heard people saying that, I kept thinking, but we do have a Wakanda. There is a Wakanda in real life. It's called Ethiopia. Ethiopia, again, is in many ways similar to the fictional Wakanda. It's an independent black African country that is ancient, that has been around since most countries now that currently exist. It's never been colonized. It's been an independent African nation, the only one on the whole continent. It also, like the fictional Wakanda, has resources and has a rich heritage that remains largely unknown to the outside world. Nubia, which was like a region of different kingdoms, and Christianity came into this region also at a very early stage in the 4th century, in the 300s, through missionary efforts from Egyptian monks. And so the flavor of Christianity that was popular in Egypt also was very much dominant in Nubia as well.
Nubia, about 200 years later, also embraces Christianity, also voluntarily. And what is interesting, where you can tell that is that when Islam arises, and then when Islam begins to conquer North Africa, these two places, Nubia and Ethiopia, remain the only Christian kingdoms in Africa.
When we talk about Nubian Christianity, that the territory is a lot more expansive than just say modern day Ethiopia and Eritrea. It would have extended into the northern part of what we would know of as South Africa, and even part of what we would call Sudan.
Within the western part of Africa, especially going along the Atlantic coast, Christianity there is introduced by the Portuguese. But you should note that the introduction is not one where Portugal has colonies within Africa in the 1400s or 1500s, but that it is Portuguese traders and explorers who are trying to find a way, the quickest way, to get to India, to get to Asia and engage in trade so they won't have to go through Muslim lands.
The first 700 years of Christianity, North Africa is early Christianized, and then very quickly Christianity becomes widespread in North Africa. Now, at that time with the spread of Islam, Western North Africa, Christianity falls off the scene. Christianity continues in Egypt and in Ethiopia throughout Christian history, but in Western Africa, Christianity disappears for a while until the European missionaries start to come back into Africa.
As early as the 1450s, within that Senegambia area, that area where Senegal and Gambia are today, in that area, you have one African chief who is trying to figure out whether he wants to embrace Islam or Christianity. So he asked both the imam and the priest, present to me the message that your religions proclaim. And I don't know how long it took for this discussion to go on, for this presentation to go on. But at the end of the day, that chief decides he will not embrace Islam, he will embrace Christianity. So it's not by the sword, but it's by choice. It's not by embracing Christianity ignorantly, but it's by being informed by Christianity. It's not embracing Christianity in isolation. He knows what the traditional religion teaches. He is being introduced to what Islam teaches, and he's then being introduced to what Christianity teaches, and he chooses Christianity. You have in Benin, also in the late 1400s, a king also requesting to be educated within the faith, also embracing the faith and seeking baptism and being baptized, he and some others within his kingdom. You also have Angola embracing Christianity, and they embraced Christianity also during the late 1500s. And there's a movement to create a college. It folds, unfortunately, during the mid-1500s, but another one reopens up within the Congo and opens up in Angola by the 1600s. But the story that has the longest history is a little further south to Congo. That's where you have the longest story. And there again, it's the story where the king is curious about this new faith. But in this case, the king says that I don't merely want to learn from what the Portuguese come to Congo and teach him. He wants to send some of his young men to Europe. He wants them to go there, number one, to be educated, to learn the faith, to observe how this Christian kingdom or kingdoms operate, come back to him, and then confirm whether what the traders or the priests or the missionaries were saying, whether it was true or not. And so in this case, that happens. By 1491, they return. The king then is willing to embrace Christianity, and he's willing to follow it within this model where one has to be the husband of one wife. We have to get our mind straight that prior to the arrival of the first African and what becomes the United States, you have this Christian kingdom or Christian empire with a school system, with chapels, with an educated group of people. And therefore, we have to not let the slave trade narrative cloud us to what it was like to be an African Christian along the coast of Africa, or to be an African Christian within Ethiopia, or to be an African Christian within Europe.
Any of you know there's a book in the Bible called the Book of Acts? In the Book of Acts in chapter 8, it talks about an Ethiopian that I prefer to call a captain or a treasurer. Some people call him an Ethiopian eunuch. But he's an Ethiopian that gets baptized. He's, according to Martin Luther, the great reformer of the Protestant church, he, according to Martin Luther, was the first Gentile to be baptized within the church. And so therefore, if one says, if the first non-Jew to be baptized in the church is an African, how can someone say that you received it in servitude?
So the Reformation is said to begin in 1517 when Martin Luther first challenges some of the teachings of the papacy and the Western Catholic Church. He nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the church at Wittenberg in Germany, and this was supposed to raise a debate and a discussion, but by then the printing press had been discovered or invented, and they spread these 95 Theses throughout Europe, and this causes really just a firestorm of debate. So Martin Luther is put on trial for heresy, he's condemned for heresy, and even though he escapes with his life, this creates a situation in Europe where everyone has to choose. Are we going to go with this new Protestant view, or are we going to trust the papacy and the Catholic Church? Now in Africa, where people like Augustine were from, Christianity has disappeared from North Africa by this time. Under centuries of Islamic rule, they eventually die out of North Africa. But in Egypt and in Ethiopia, there's still a thriving church, so it's called the Coptic Church in Egypt, and with that is the Ethiopian Church, which largely functioned independently. With the spread of Islam, these churches really get isolated from the rest of Christianity, and they just continue on in their own way and in their own practices. And so they never really even know about the Reformation or what's happening. And that's partly because they have preserved their own tradition and were not really brought into some of the medieval practices that Martin Luther was protesting.
Even before Martin Luther, even before the European Protestant Reformation, Africans were already in the business and were at work in revolutionizing and reforming Christian tradition to bring it more in line with biblical teachings. Stephanos lived in the 14th century in Ethiopia, and he actually started a reform movement in Ethiopia. Because Ethiopian Christianity, like most other parts of East Africa, was Orthodox. This was before the Protestant Reformation, and so most of them were Orthodox. But Stephanos actually started a reform movement where he began to challenge a lot of the traditional beliefs in the Ethiopian Orthodox dominant church, especially issues of the king involving himself in church ordinations, in prostration before the king, as Stephanos and his followers were resisting that, saying we should not bow before anybody but Jesus. And also, he was challenging the high veneration in Ethiopian Christianity paid towards Mary and almost the deification of Mary. And also, he challenged the placement of any authority or any teaching on the same level as Scripture. If you notice, a lot of these issues that Stephanos was bringing up are similar to the issues that Martin Luther was challenging the Catholic Church in Europe. And so you could say that the Protestant Reformation actually started in Africa and not in Europe, and it was over a century before.
Luther belonged to what was called the Augustinian order. And so Augustine was a hero to him. Augustine was the most influential thinker to Martin Luther outside of the Bible itself. And so for Luther, he knew that there was a time period in Africa before the papacy had this kind of worldwide power. In fact, Martin Luther had learned about the Ethiopian church, and it was said to be one of the inspirations for him calling for a Protestant church, a separate church from Rome. And he said, if the Ethiopian church has continued with its practices since ancient times, surely Protestants can recover that kind of Christianity. When Christians went from Europe back to North Africa as missionaries, they brought with them a Christianity encapsulated in European culture. But when they did that, there's no doubt that they brought Christianity dressed in white European form. And so they literally wanted Africans to put on what they called Christian clothes, but it was European clothes. And they wanted Africans who converted to Christianity to look Christian, but that meant to look like European Christians.
In Africa, when European missionaries went to Africa and converted Africans to Christianity, baptized them, they gave them what they called a Christian name. And first of all, there's no such thing as a Christian name. We know you could be named anything and be a Christian, a follower of Christ. But it's not like the Europeans were even giving the Africans biblical names. What they called Christian names were just European names. So that's why even to this day, you have a lot of Africans who have a name that's half European and half African. So you have Nelson Mandela. Nelson is European. Nelson is supposedly his Christian name. Desmond Tutu. Desmond is supposedly his Christian name. Patrice Lumumba. Patrice was supposedly his Christian name.
The question is, how do we get to this idea of a white European, fundamentally non-Jewish Jesus? And what I would say is you have to go back to a formative period in German biblical scholarship where they were trying to figure out this question. They're trying to figure out, how did Christianity go from being a local form of Judaism to something that was worldwide? And so the idea was that in order for Christianity to become a worldwide religion, it had to get rid of the things that made it particular. And the things that made it particular were mostly the Jewish elements. So the idea that in as much as Jesus became less Jewish, he became more universal.
There tended to be, in the European regions, pictures of Jesus looking white, as all the pictures did. They sort of drew these images in their own image, their own reflection.
And so what you had then in the early period of German biblical scholarship is the remaking of Jesus as not this Jewish Messiah, but basically this proto-German progressive figure who met the cultural needs of the day.
The colonial presence that came into North Africa was able to utilize this missionary Christian presence as a way of subjugating the people, right? It was a battle for hearts and minds, but it happened in such a way that used sort of the worst impulses of medieval Christianity, and they would misquote the Bible and say things like, slaves, obey your masters, and you will have hope for heaven in the next life, but now you may have a life of servitude. And if you combine that with pictures of Jesus, who are always looking like a European, this did become a form of oppression.
And I just don't understand how we as a people historically put so much faith into this thing called God, but yet for 400 years we were in chains. For 400 years we prayed. It's just weird. It's just weird, man.
Frederick Douglass said it the best in one sense in writing in his appendix to the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, and I try to quote, the words have been so imprinted on my mind. He said something like, I write this so that those who've read the foregoing narrative might presume that I am opposed to all religion. That could not be true. He says, but between the Christianity of this land and Christianity proper, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to be the friend of one is to be the enemy of the other. He goes on to say, I hate the women whipping, cradle plundering, people stealing Christianity of this land. I love the peaceable, sincere Christianity of Christ.
Sure. So let's take the objection of Christianity as a white man's religion based on what happened to slaves.
Sure.
And let's deep dive how you would respond to that.
Sure. Before I got into urban apologetics, I'm just a naturally inquisitive person, And I recall I was sitting down, listening to some guys on YouTube who were like, oh man, Christianity is a white man's religion. And, it was taken from Horus and it was beat into our ancestors. And I don't even know how I stumbled across the video. But I'm sitting here listening to it at my overtime job. And it just kind of hit me all of a sudden. I was like, but dang, maybe that's right. Maybe that's true. And if so, what are the implications of that? Now, like I said, I'm naturally inquisitive, so it wasn't enough for me to kind of leave it at that. I had to go study it out for myself. And so specifically in regard to this notion that Christianity was beaten to the slaves, I wanted to know the truth, right? So what I did was I started buying sources, particularly slave narratives, right? I wanted to know, what did the slaves feel about Christianity, and if I could find them talking about Christianity in their own words. And what's very interesting is that I entered into my own little research project with the assumption that, basically you have this Kunta Kinte scenario where the slave masters got the Bible in one hand and the bullwhip in the other, beating Christianity into the slave. That was my perspective. But then I was studying one day and I came across a quote from an enslaved person. He talks about how they used to pray, on their plantation, but the next plantation over, there was no praying and no singing, and that the slaves on that plantation would get beat for that. And it was like, well, wait a minute. I thought that Christianity was beaten to the slaves full stop. That was like the only model through which, African enslaved persons engaged Christianity. But here you have this, enslaved person talking about how the folks on the next plantation over would get beat for singing, praying, and so on and so forth. So the light bulb kind of went off for me, like, well, wait a minute. Maybe this Kunta Kinte scenario isn't the only means by which African enslaved persons engage Christianity or encounter Christianity. So I started digging even more. And I started finding more and more quotations like that, like one from W.L. Boss, where he explicitly says that the slave masters didn't want them to have any religion or education. But he says that something on the inside just told us about God. And so what you see after a while is where I started with like this kind of tunnel vision view of what it was like for a slave to encounter Christianity, just that Kunta Kinte scenario. I then found that there's some other pieces to the historical puzzle that give us a broader lens. So for example, the fact of the matter is, and this is also documented by Dr. Catherine Gerber, I was reading one of her works recently. The fact of the matter is, for a significant portion of the transatlantic slave era, you had slave masters actively opposing the preaching of the gospel to the slave.
Most Protestant slave owners did not want enslaved people to become Christian. They thought that an enslaved Christian would rebel, would challenge sort of the fundamental law of slavery. And so as a result, they reacted violently when enslaved people tried to become Christian, tried to access baptism in the vast majority of cases.
Particularly here in America, prior to us being a nation, we were under English common law, right? And under English common law, it was illegal to own another Christian as a slave.
In the 1650s, you see the first laws, the first slave laws being created in places like Barbados and Virginia and New York. And in those laws, you see that Christians, like if you read through them, the word Christian, it actually just means European free person.
The dilemma for slave masters who considered themselves Christians to introduce Christianity to a slave meant that if that slave was baptized, they could not be a slave any longer.
So what you had is Africans either coming from the Congo, which had already encountered Christianity prior to the transatlantic slave trade really popping off, or Africans who had, been yoked up and brought over here to the Western world, claiming to be Christians or claiming to having been baptized and petitioning for their freedom on the basis of being a Christian.
There's a woman, she was enslaved and then she gained her freedom. A woman named Murata. She later changed her name to Magdalena, but she was very likely either exposed to Catholicism or was Catholic in Africa, was enslaved, transported to the Caribbean, where she then eventually converted to Moravian Christianity.
Thomas Gage, he was a judge in, I want to say, Pennsylvania. And so you have some slaves petitioning to him. Peter Bestis was an enslaved person who made a petition for his freedom on the basis of having been Christian.
This is sort of another legacy of this idea that Christianity was forced down Africans' throats, is that it's like we forgot that there was already a history of Christianity in Africa.
First of all, we have to understand that blacks didn't receive the Christian faith first in America. There were Christians that came across to America during the Middle Passage.
The Protestants the white Protestants who are writing down the records that we read, it wasn't in their interest to recognize sort of the African history of Christianity, but it was there.
The slavers potentially were looking at slavery as an economic system. And in order to validate that economic system, there needed to be some validation. There needed to be some authoritative validation. And the only authority in the land of that particular period, that particular time, during the antebellum period in North America, was the Bible.
The slave Bible essentially edited out all of the passages about liberation and about God wanting to free his people, and emphasized a slaves obey your master theme.
If slave masters were so interested in promoting Christianity to slaves, they would not be removing all of the significant narratives in the Bible related to things like the Exodus.
We know about the coaxing of slave preachers, not black slave preachers, but they did exist too, but who never read whole narratives about the liberative power of God. Like there's a whole book in the Bible, the book of Exodus, that's all about God delivering his people from slavery.
Any kind of text that had a liberation-oriented theme to it, they wanted to get rid of those passages of scripture from the Old to the New Testament.
There are many wonderful illustrations throughout the Old Testament in the Pentateuch where even the concept of slavery was never ordained by God. It was never settled by God. It's a provision to bring order to chaos. But even within that provision, slavery was not what we know of as American chattel slavery. It did not dehumanize, and there were always provisions to work out of it.
And then for blacks to get this Bible and to read it for themselves, not taking hook, line, and sinker the interpretation of their slave masters, is actually an act of protest, not an act of just laying down and being docile.
Clearly, slave masters were not interested in slaves becoming Christians. In fact, the data shows us, not only from interviews that have been done with slaves, but again, some of the documentation shows us that when slaves became Christians, their desires and their hopes for freedom only intensified, it increased.
Take heed therefore unto yourselves
and to all the flock over the which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers.
They did not become docile as a result of Christianity. Their desires for freedom only increased.
Beware of false prophets who come dressed in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravening wolves.
One of the first slave rebellions, the Stono Rebellion, was some scholars think that these were actually Catholics from the Kingdom of Congo. So they very well may have been Catholic before they even were enslaved. They were transported to South Carolina, where they knew, that if they could escape to Florida, they could either become Catholic or reclaim their Catholicism and gain their freedom. And so the Stono Rebellion was this group of sort of newly arrived men from the Kingdom of Congo who were trying to get to Florida.
Slaves seem to embody the liberation of the gospel in the state of their oppression in ways that slave masters, quite frankly, could not. And so the slaves actually represented to the slave master what authentic Christianity really was.
Slavery wasn't just a physical condition, okay? It was very much so a spiritual, mental oppression. And Dr. Roberto talks about how conversion to Christianity is the antithesis to that, because now you're saying to the world that, yes, you may have my body, but you cannot have my soul.
The faith of slaves was a faith that could endure tremendous hardships in hope that God is able and willing to bring liberation.
We would love it if you had slavery outlawed in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But one of the things that we see even in history is that laws are ineffective at completely transforming behavior. And so what I think that what the Bible is trying to do in the fullness of time is, rather than simply saying, here's a flat rule against slavery, but to create the kind of people for whom slavery is unimaginable.
So the shift from Christian to developing the language of whiteness, we can see it in the 17th century and early 18th century records. And what I found when I read through these, I read through every single law that was written in Barbados, from the 1650s until the 1730s. And what you can see is that it's around the late 1690s where the language of racial whiteness enters into the law books and literally replaces the word Christian. Right? So there are some laws that are passed multiple years in a row. One is about Christian servants, and it's called Christian servants, and then in 1697, all of a sudden it's white servants. What happens, right? And so I really wanted to understand, how does Protestant supremacy become white supremacy? And if you look at the records and you compare the law books to the baptismal records, what you see is that, while the vast majority of slave owners would not allow enslaved people to become Christian, some enslaved people were able to fight their way into Christian churches, some Anglican, some Quaker, some other. And by the 1690s, some of those people had also gained their freedom. And you have to remember that in the 17th century, being a Christian was also sort of part of how you gained political power, right? It was very closely associated with freedom. And we have the first few, especially free Black Christian men who should have been able to vote in elections and potentially hold political office. And this is exactly the moment where you see the language of whiteness inserted into the law books. And one of the most important places where you see it is in the first law that defines who is allowed to vote in an election. And so in 1697, so just as you have a large enough population of free Black Christians, coming to church, that's where you have a new law that says, oh, by the way, in addition to having to be 21 and a property owner and Christian and male, you also have to be white if you want to vote. And so I think that this is a really important moment to recognize that they would never say out loud what they're actually trying to do, right? But by comparing the baptismal records and the legal records, we can see this story happening in the background. And what you realize is that the creation of whiteness, because it is a creation, was this very intentional political decision on the part of these specific slave-owning politicians in order to, reduce the ability of free Black Christian people from gaining full access to political power. And it was one of a series of steps in sort of redefining Christianity in this period.
Even slaves back in the 16, 17, and 1800s recognized a real difference between the fake perpetrated Christianity of white slaveholding religion and the genuine true Christianity of Jesus Christ. That's where you get the Black church from. It's a theological distinction. You get the Black church from people who recognize that the God of the Bible was being misrepresented.
The Black church, it is an ecclesial tradition, okay, that was really formed as a theological response to cultural legalism. Cultural legalism says that you cannot be made right with God unless you become one of us culturally.
Black churches began because white Christians in America would not honor the Imago Dei in Black people.
Blacks, especially during the period in which they were enslaved, were actually considered second-class citizens even in the church. They could not come to the Lord's table on an equal basis. They could not, in many cases, they couldn't even be baptized. Okay, and so the Black church itself was a statement that said, "It is not whiteness that brings me into relationship with God. It is Jesus Christ alone." And if this form of church is going to insist that we must be white in order to be made right with God, well, we're going to worship God elsewhere.
And so what chocolate people decided to do was not to divorce themselves from the God of the Bible, but rather to gather on their own, apart from non-Black people or the oppressive slave system that considered itself Christianity.
It was really a kind of reformation. It was a kind of second reformation. It was a theological, ecclesial theological revolution, really. And it can only be understood and properly understood in that light. It wasn't merely a social movement, but it was a theological movement that had very major social implications.
Black Christianity has continued to evolve in American history. The theology wasn't evolving so much as its response to the constant of racial oppression.
How did the church influence the civil rights movement?
The civil rights movement would not have happened had it not been for Negro churches and Black pastors. How about that? There is no civil rights movement apart from Fred Shuttlesworth, Ralph Abernathy, Martin Luther King Sr. and Jr., and Otis Moss Jr., and so many others.
One of the things that people do is they want to say that all of the leaders of the civil rights movement weren't Christian. Well, that's true, but at the center of the civil rights movement is Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And that was all led by pastors. But beyond the leadership of the pastors, which is largely male, if you go from the top level and you begin to look at the people who actually marched, the people who were in the pews, the people who walked instead of taking the bus, these people are fundamentally Christian.
The praying mothers of the movement, the what we might call the foot soldiers of the movement, were the saints in these churches. And so it was in many ways a local church movement. Given the goodness of God, right, and given the power of God, why do I find myself suffering, right? Because God being all good, God would not want me to suffer. God being all powerful, God is able to prevent my suffering. So why do I find myself suffering? And God doesn't want me to, and God can do something about it. Why am I suffering?
When you deal with trauma or you deal with jarring circumstances or situations, you need a narrative in order to make that trauma make sense to you. That's how our brains work. Our brains have to formulate a narrative so that what we've experienced makes sense.
Authenticity is a thing for us just because we want to know that our human experience is a shared experience. It's kind of like, we want to know that the people who are speaking into us are people who have positions of influence, that though they are esteemed or exalted, they're actually just as complicated as we are.
Persecution, really, that pressure of persecution breeds a certain kind of solidarity. Our Christianity had to evolve to help us to know how to engage those institutions and those realities in a way that was faithful to Christ.
And I do think that we got a chance to discuss very frankly the issues which we face in Chicago.
My city is a great example of how Black churches sought to hinder the message and the movement of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and SCLC, and really the civil rights movement as a whole. J.H. Jackson, the spirited orator of the Olivet Baptist Church.
Jackson said that King and his associates were unconstitutional in their methods. And he preferred something called patronage politics, was basically trying to win the love and affection of people in power bit by bit.
He was a gradualist who felt that if we just worked hard, pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, worked within the system, that one day we would become leaders within the system and could change things. But one of the things that King said to those people is that the system wasn't broke. It's not broke. It's working just the way it was designed to work. It wasn't designed to work for us.
I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps. But it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps.
King understood that you can't be neutral on sin, right? You're either fighting against it or you're fighting for it.
I often think of the person who introduced Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., at the March on Washington in August of 1963.
At this time, I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation.
He called him the moral leader of our nation. Think of that. And not even the president was the moral leader of our nation.
King was able to galvanize really the nation and really in some ways the world behind the Black social situation, right? So that other people, not just African Americans, but whites could actually white liberals could get involved. The Catholic Church got involved.
He did not popularize prophetic preaching, but he certainly underscored it and gave birth to a new generation of Black preachers who were erudite, who were scholarly, who are incredibly articulate and passionate about the transformation of the conditions of our people.
I may be in jail, but I am somebody.
What was it that drove them from their kind of passivity into the streets? Well, the idea was, and Martin Luther King talks about it, the idea of somebodyness that is explicit in the gospel message.
All men and women are made in the image of God, and therefore we are, more than what the Constitution says, entitled to some inalienable rights.
And insomuch as a society denies those privileges, they're denying God.
What Martin King understood was that violence was already a daily part of the reality all over the South. That segregation itself carried its own kind of violence. The violence of slavery, the violence of lynching, the violence of the Ku Klux Klan. These are terroristic institutions. And so King said, look, we are not introducing new suffering, but what we're doing is we are engaging the suffering in such a way that exposes the violence that's already there. And if we don't, the violence will continue unchecked.
There can be no communication between the masters and the slaves until masters no longer exist as masters, are no longer present as masters. The Christian task is to rebel against all masters.
After almost a decade of nonviolent direct activity, the foot soldiers were getting tired of getting bit by dogs and having hoses turned onto them. And so over time, the radical message of Malcolm X began to sort of gain some traction. And so after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the foot soldiers began to ask the question, if they would kill the prophetic voice of peace and nonviolence, what are they going to do to us? James Cone emerged, and he was trying to, in his 1969 book, Black Theology and Black Power, he was trying to wed the theology of the Black church with the Black power of Malcolm X.
I wanted to address my blackness, but yet at the same time, I was a Christian.
Black liberation theology is really, I think, best understood as being a movement that was a kind of theological expression of the Black Power movement.
I think when you talk about Black liberation theology, it's not a monolith, it's a multitude of things. But I would say that at the center of Black liberation theology is the idea that God is fundamentally a God who is on the side of the oppressed. That the Exodus is paradigmatic for understanding the nature of God.
The reason we got Black liberation theology is because that liberative power of the gospel was not preached to Black people. And so you get people like James Cone and J.D. Otis Roberts who write about it because they see within the academy a dearth of representation or application of the gospel toward Black people.
Particularly Cone, in books like The Cross and the Lynching Tree, he puts his finger on Black pain. He grew up in Arkansas, so he knows what it's like to be under the thumb of Jim Crow and racism and all of those things. And when James Cone and Black liberation theology is coming of age, it's not in the first and foremost coming of age in kind of rebellion against or in contrast with the Black church or even kind of what we consider conservative Christianity. James Cone is sitting at Union looking at the fecklessness of kind of white progressive theology and saying this has no relevant word to the people of my day.
And that fundamental longing and intuition, I think, is correct. The idea that God is for the oppressed, right? That God is the God of the oppressed, okay? However, its methodology, right? Because it is wedded to a methodology that sort of seeks retaliation, right? It's not expressing kind of what we would suggest is really the way of Christ in terms of its methodology.
The problem with that is that it doesn't start with the gospel. It starts with an affirmation of our ethnicity. There's nothing wrong with our ethnicity being affirmed. The challenge is that when that affirmation is not rooted in the truth of the gospel, it morphs into something it was not created to be. It becomes an idol.
The Bible isn't less than political liberation, it's simply more than that. That when God says to the people of Egypt, let my people go, the reason they need to be free is so that they might worship him. And insomuch as liberation theology doesn't have a sufficient account of worship of the one true God as the purpose of liberation, not simply political liberation, but political liberation so that we might be free to worship God. This is the same thing that Zechariah says when he gives his statement about his son. He says they want to be free from Rome, but he says in Luke, we might be free to worship him without fear. That was the purpose of liberation.
We need to have our ethnicity affirmed, but it needs to be affirmed from the gospel. We need to have our humanity affirmed, but it needs to be affirmed from the gospel. And so, in that regards, Black liberation theology is a gift to the church, but to those who are unredeemed, it's a cult to be pursued. And I think that's a great risk. We need those who have an understanding of the truth of God to undergird the liberative power of the gospel for all people of every ilk and in every society. It was Black pastors, Black preachers, and Black theologians that stirred the affections and raised the moral conscience of the United States to hear the truth of the gospel.
The Black church has contributed to the Black community in several different ways. I mean, just throughout history, it's been consistently a place where Blacks have gone to find solace.
The place of a place of dignity, right? Where we are, because we live in a context where we are marginalized culturally. The Black church was one place where we could be us. We could be completely us. We didn't have to check part of ourselves at the door.
Scholarships and hospitals and colleges and universities, matron clubs, women's teas, the teaching of etiquette to our girls and our boys, the sanctuary, the safety of our men, the production of some of our leading people in America all came through Black churches. Businesses, school teachers, bankers, lawyers, politicians. What has the Black church given to the Black community? Its soul, its identity, and its protection.
I think part of the problem, so this is interesting. I think part of the problem with the construct of Christianity being a white man's religion is the culture that is attached to it, right? This very suburban or even heroic driven idea that in order for me to be a Christian, now I have to become like this pastor. I have to become this individual who saves people or things, right? Where I think the narrative within Black Christian tradition has been more, I think, right, and we can argue about this, is that Christianity informs more about who I am, and it's ingrained in everything I do. The music that I make, God is in that. Like the way that I work, like I'm not just working for myself, I'm working for the glory of God and for the community, right? And I think throughout history, I think Black Christian tradition has had to include the church in everything it's done because it was one of the only institutions we had. And so the theology informed us to include God in everything we did. And so that's why you saw a lot of musicians who, like Sam Cooke or Sister Rosetta, who had this interesting dynamic of being in the church while at the same time influencing secular markets and even becoming mainstream artists.
The one religion that is most associated with hip hop is Islam. And even a lot of the phrases that are common to hip hop came from Islam. Rakim, Public Enemy, the Poor Righteous Teachers. back in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a group called X-Clan that was incredibly Afrocentric. And they were promoting Egyptology and Kemetic science. The interesting thing is that I would argue that there are more Christian rappers than Islamic rappers. And the interesting thing that a lot of people don't know as well is that early Christian hip hop in the early 1990s, a lot of it was quote unquote conscious. I don't mean conscious being opposed to Christianity, but I mean conscious in terms of dealing with Black history and dealing with the issues that African Americans face.
My brother hit me to cross movement. And what was interesting about the cross movement was these were individuals, when I heard their music, I was like, yo, they sound authentically connected to the culture of hip hop. Like they don't feel like when I'm listening to them, I don't feel like they're faking it or forcing it. Like I'm like, nah, this is, oh, they use that word in the right context. Oh snap! Like the dialect, like this, you know, it's just all fit. It just felt natural. But not only did the culture feel natural, like the things they were communicating, I was like, bro, these dudes, how many books have they read? Like these dudes are deep. And as they kind of describe themselves, like I was like, these jokers are like a Christian Wu-Tang.
There was a group called SFC, Soldiers for Christ. Their second album, they had a picture of Malcolm X and Huey Newton on the cover. And they wrote about killing what they called the spirit of the nigga, which was, they were saying that African Americans have been taught to behave like niggers, and that was negative. And they were saying we need to learn how to get rid of that negative spirit and become the men that God created us to be. A group called Idle King had a song called I'm Black and I'm Proud. A group called Freedom of Soul had a tribute to Martin Luther King on one of their albums. So a lot of Christian hip hop dealt with Black issues as well in the early 90s.
Hip hop has always been social and science, right? Those are the things that are highlighted. What's going on in society and in the science of things. And hip hop started in the Northeast, started in New York in the early 70s. Soul music, R&B music has been spiritual and sexual, right? And it started in the South, in the antebellum South. And so those elements of a Christian foundation are connected to Southerners often. And these elements of scientific mathematical thinking and the ideals of Malcolm X and the 5% Nation are Northeastern. And what I see often is that the idea of a Southerner from a Northeastern person is a little bit slow, a little bit less educated, a little bit primitive. And the idea is that we escaped all of the oppression of the South and the lack of education to come up north. And so we're throwing all of this baby out with the bathwater. But we've also thrown away this faith that we felt was oppressive as well. And so we're not bringing any of these things with us. And as of late, people have started to go back to their roots and say, okay, wait a minute. We can't leave the fried chicken and the collard greens down south. There's some good stuff here. But authentic Christianity is something that was left. That's something that, was ours, and we left it there and went up north and said, now we want to be a part of science and not spirituality.
Hip hop is one of the few areas in American life where Black men see themselves in power. I would say sports, maybe entertainment, and hip hop. That's why Black men are so drawn to it, because there's very few sectors of American society where you see Black men in power. And hip hop, even though we don't control the industry, we do control the art form or the stuff that's talked about. And that is where, that's why a lot of black men are drawn to it. And so when they promote Islam or consciousness or Hebrew Israelite religions, then that's why a lot of black men are impacted by it.
Being that we're seen as minorities and white people are the control of everything that's going on, it's kind of pushed towards them because it was given to us from Europeans and things like that. So since I've come to college, I'm not gonna lie, I like tell people all the time, yeah, I'm not a Christian anymore. Because that came from, you know, parents trying to tell you what's right and what's wrong.
Why is it important for churches to teach early African Christianity?
I'm Marquise, and my take on it is religion itself is a pseudoscience. It's used to, like they say, like everyone before me has said, to control and brainwash.
Well, for one reason, it's evangelistic. You know, we as Christians, Jesus told us, go out into the world and make disciples and teach them to obey my words. Well, a part of making disciples is contending for the faith. As Jude 3 tells us, contend for the faith. So it's evangelistic to have a knowledge of African church history and black presence in the Bible.
It's not 100% for our people, and how other religions, who they worship is their skin color, and the Christianity religion, it's, well, the white man's Christianity religion has a white Jesus, and we're supposed to worship him.
I think it's imperative that we teach not only early African Christianity, but African American Christianity in a more honest and robust manner, right? Because it doesn't just help inform black people. I think it makes a more robust and useful Christianity in general.
I think black people in particular, we teach that how we got to America. We don't teach where we originally come from all the time. We didn't, especially those who came by way of slavery. We don't say we started in Africa.
Most members of the conscious community, most people who are black Hebrew Israelites, most members of the Nation of Islam grew up in the church, including Malcolm X and Louis Farrakhan.
Just like a lot of other people, I grew up in the church, things of that nature, and there was a lot of things that didn't make sense all the time, but to reiterate the point of as far as using religion as a tool to brainwash black people, I'm a firm believer in that.
My faith was pretty critically damaged by just hearing a Western, predominantly white, Eurocentric perspective of Christianity, especially in a time when there was a lot of hostility between, races in America at the height of the police shootings and whatnot. And I wasn't hearing a lot of my white brothers and sisters give any answers or any thoughts on what was going on. I felt hurt. And for me, I just assumed this was how the whole faith was. So I had to take some steps back. And when I began to take some steps back and read books like The Lost History of Christianity and, listen to scholars like Vincent Bantu, I began to have my faith strengthened and realize that, this society we live in does not have a monopoly on our faith, and that the faith is bigger and broader than I understood it to be, and that I'm a part of the narrative. I'm not just, the descendant of a slave who has to do what this, controlling book says I have to do, but I'm a part of a grander narrative.
We always see ourselves in need of being delivered, but we should also see ourselves as the one who delivers, who are helping white people, who are helping people, not just white people, black people who don't understand their importance, their image bearing, that they reflect the image of God.
I actually contacted a Coptic church, about 10 miles from my house. And I called the priest, and he, invites me to come on down, take a look around and check out the church and that kind of stuff. I walk in, and the first thing I see is just wall to wall, different pictures of African faces. What stuck out to me was like Athanasius, Moses the Black. They had a big picture of him sitting up there. And so I'm sitting there, I'm kind of talking to some of the, the members, before the priest came and got me, and finally get a chance to sit down with him. And he was just talking about this unbroken heritage that the Coptic Church has with the earliest days of Christianity. And I felt like it was my first time really being, in contact with the faith in the way that allowed me to feel that it was truly something ancient that I was engaged in, that it wasn't just a modern Western transplant from somewhere else in the world, but I really felt at home. It may have been the first time, where I felt at home in Christianity in relation to my ethnic self.
What would be your message to those who are struggling with the idea that Christianity is a white man's religion?
I think my encouragement is the struggle is good because it means that you're asking good questions. It means that you've observed something that's just not sitting right with you. I think what I would say to that then is also do your research. And don't do your research with people that are just agreeing with you. Do your research with people who you might think are their enemy or in opposition to you.
I can understand that concern because in many ways what we have known in Western Christianity has too often been a white form of Christianity. And yet I would just want to point out that that's bad church history.
I would challenge them to really begin to read the biblical text. Look in the Genesis passage. Where does the creation take place? Where is the garden of God? Ethiopia is mentioned prominently.
I would say my primary message to them would be that the gospel of Jesus Christ is bigger than white supremacy. And that actually, not only is that shown to be true in Scripture, but it's also shown to be true in African history. If you actually look at Coptic, Nubian, and Ethiopian literature, if you look at the archaeology, the architecture, the paintings that come, the history that is left for us from all of our ancestors, these are the places where Black history begins. For those of us in the diaspora and even on the extremities of the continent, this is where Black African history begins. If we go back and look at this history, the short and summarized narrative is that these ancient Africans had their own religions, and when they heard the gospel of Jesus Christ, they walked away from those religions and they became Christians. And they believed upon the gospel of Jesus Christ freely. And they left behind a rich and vast amount of evidence to show that this is true, and also to give us a window into what their life with Christ was like. My encouragement would be, look at what they wrote, and look at what they drew, and look at what they built. It all was pointed to the glory of Jesus Christ.
Not only do you have individuals who were willing to die, but they gave their lives for this. You have folks like David Walker, abolitionists like Harriet Tubman,
like Phyllis Wheatley, like Mariah Stewart, like Ida B. Wells.
You have the Dim McVisseys, you have the Nat Turners,
Sojourner Truth, Mary McLeod Bethune, for God's sake.
You have people who also, who contributed to the burgeoning thought of Black collective identity, like Pan-African movement. In a lot of ways, many people will say it came from a Christian, Alexander Crummell, and Martin R. Delaney.
Again, go back to Marcus Garvey. A lot of people have no idea that he was actually a Christian. He in one speech, he talked about his Nicene faith.
It was their faith that caused them to stand up against the injustices of their day.
It was Christianity that formed their worldview, that formed their convictions, and it was Christianity that gave them the fire to be advocates for the rights of Africans, the civil rights, the human rights. It was Christianity that gave shape to that because of the ethos of Christianity. The biblical ethos gave them the framework to talk about that with conviction and to be willing to die if it came down to it.
Read Maratha's letter, read actual
Again, we don't have that many documents, but the documents that we have from these early Christians, I think they're so powerful, and they just negate so clearly all of that later propaganda. So, you know, go to the sources, like read the actual things and listen to those people.
I think that just like I experienced, that people could have a better understanding of the how rooted in the African continent Christianity is. You know, I mean, it's been there for 2,000 years, with about 1,500 of that coming before the transatlantic slave trade. Then I think they too could, see why there's nothing really antithetical about or oxymoronic about being Black and Christian.
Christianity has always been a diverse movement. There has always been Christianity first off in Judea and Palestine, and that was not a white Caucasian area. It spread quickly into areas like Syria and Persia and the Far East. It spread quickly into Africa, into Egypt and Ethiopia and far western North Africa.
And so African history itself points to the reality that Jesus Christ and his gospel and his kingdom are more powerful than white supremacy. It's more powerful than slavery, and it's more powerful than colonialism, and it actually precedes it.
You cannot read the biblical text with any honesty or seriousness without seeing the Black presence in the biblical text and Black people within the biblical text.
We implore you, man, be born again, trust Jesus Christ. We implore you again, do research and let history and truth speak for itself.
To go back to the AME quote is to seek for ourselves, right? It's time out for us believing the things that one media or even popular academia has given us, right? Because there's resources out there, there's information out there.
Pull from resources and books and documentaries that are speaking or trying to answer the question that you're answering. And I think alongside of this research, be willing to pray and trust that God will lead you in the right direction. Because even if you are having difficulty with knowing who to pray to, I think that however you pray, God is still listening. And so I think be willing to take the risk of saying, hey, God, lead me to the truth about who you are. And I think in that kind of space, God will lead you to where you got to go.
I would say read the Bible for yourself. Open your heart and ask God to speak to you, and you'll discover the truth that this ship has landed many of thousands. Not just white people, not just Black people, but people of every tribe, nation, and tongue. The gospel is bigger than one ethnic group. And one day you will stand before the King of Kings. And if you do what I just recommended, and simply opening the scriptures, read through the book of John, and you're going to thank God you saw this video that a chocolate preacher told you, let God have a chance to show himself to be what he is. And you stand before him and you recognize him as a King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and you will bow willingly, not forcefully.
Trying to hide out from the monsters, I knew that God was above us. These were the values instilled in me by my mother. Mandatory dinner time, Bible verses before supper. She one of the reasons I'm even packing my luggage while she was packing up lunches. Papa's packing them punches. You play fight, and I love the fact that they loved us enough to have them talks about Jesus in our discussions. Now all of that could have passed in a moment, but I translated that information and owned it. Now mama's faith is my faith, and I cannot hold it. My homie, I'm trying to tell them that I would never make it without God. I am only a human, I don't know what I'm doing. You and I would never questions I can't answer. Way too many debts that I can't cancel. Far too many powers beyond me, man. Way too many trials that I can't handle. I'm too fragile. I am a weakling on the weak.